what is a halacha leMoshe Sinai? I'm sure it's a concept you've heard of. Halacha that Moshe received in Sinai. Why are there a few halachot that are specifically designated as halacha leMoshe Sinai? We learned that all the Torah Moshe received from Sinai. So why are there only a few designated specifically as halacha leMoshe Sinai? All right, so we're going to go into Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah, where he brings this question and he answers it. He says, Yesh lato'en lomar. Right, one could say, Im hayu pirushe haTorah mekubalim im Moshe kefi hakelanim she'amarnu. If in fact, right, all the commentary, all the interpretation of the Torah was received in tradition from Moshe, as we have already stated and mentioned many times already. כשהזכרנו אומרם כל התורה נאמרו כללותיה ופרטותיה ודקדוקיה מסיני, right? We see in Parashat Behar, right? It says וידבר השם אל משה בהר סיני לאמור. God spoke to Moses in Har Sinai, and then it goes on to give a detailed account of all the misvot and all the rules and interpretations into very big detail regarding the Shemitah, the 7th sabbatical year. Now, this parasha is in the book of Vayikra. We have already left Sinai a long time ago. What does the Torah remember to mention that on this mitzvah, we received it from Sinai along with all of its detail. כל התורה נאמרו כללותיה ופרטותיה ודקדוקיה מסיני, right? אם כן, מה הם אותם ההלכות המיוחדות? So what are these specific halachot? There's maybe 30 or 35 specific halachot out of Maimonides' book of 1,000 chapters worth of halachot. There's maybe 30, 35 halachot that are specifically designated as halacha leMoshe Sinai. והנה זה יסוד צריך שתדעהו. He says, this is a fundamental principle you need to understand. והוא שהפירושים המקובלים עם משה אין בהם מחלוקת כלל. Right? I keep emphasizing this in this textbook, right? That the commentaries that were received by Moshe, there are no disputes about them. There are no two different Hachamim, Hillel and Shammai, arguing about a certain law, saying, no, you have to do it this way, and no, you have to do it this way. This doesn't exist with any of the halachot that we received from Moshe in Sinai. Lefi she'ad achshav, right, up until now, in all the 3,000 years plus that have passed since Har Sinai, לא מצאנו שנפלה מחלוקת בין החכמים בשום זמן מן הזמנים ממשה רבנו עד הרב אשה, שאחד אמר שמי שסימא אדם מסמין את עינו, כמאמר השם יתעלה עין תחת עין. Right? We have never found any dispute among any of the Chachamim, among any two people in the past 3,300 years since Har Sinai, a difference of opinion of how to interpret the pasuk, an eye for an eye. There is nobody who says that when you punch someone's eye out and blind him in one eye, then the appropriate punishment is to blind the offender in his one eye. But it's explicit in the Torah. It is an eye for an eye. However, we have never found any dispute that is not the correct interpretation. The correct interpretation is you have to compensate him monetarily. You have to pay him. Right? There's one opinion that says you need to pay, and the other one that says no, you need to blind him. גם לא מצאנו מחלוקת במה שאמר הכתוב פרי עץ הדר, right? Also regarding the ארבעת המינים, right? The four species that we take on Sukkot, right? We take the lulav, and we take the hadas, and we take the etrog and the aravot. However, it doesn't specifically say etrog in the Torah. It says peri etz hadar, a citrus fruit. Maybe you can take a lemon. Maybe you can take a grapefruit or an orange. So we never found any dispute among the Chachamim. The one says it should be an etrog, and another one says it should be some other type of citrus fruit. However, we do see a dispute between the Chachamim on how to interpret Peri Eitz Hadar. But they all accept the interpretation as the baseline that Peri Eitz Hadar is talking about citrus fruit. So what is their dispute? We'll see soon. V'chen kol kayoseh bazeh, right? And so too with all the other halachot and misvot. B'chol ha-misvot en bahen mahloket. Lefi shehem pirushim mekubalim mimoshe. Right? In all of these other misvot, there is no dispute between the Chachamim because it is all an accepted, transmitted, a tradition that we received from Moshe, generation from generation all the way to Moshe. Ve'alehem ve'al kol kayoseh bahem amru kol haTorah kula ne'emru klaloteh ufartoteh v'dikdukeh miSinai. And on these misvot and all other similar misvot is what the Chachamim say that ne'emru klaloteh ufartoteh v'dikdukeh miSinai, that all of the misvot together with all of their general rules, klaloteh, ufartoteh is perat, all the specific private cases, v'dikdukeh, and all the nuances, they were all given to us from Sinai. Aval, however, im hiyotan mekubalot, even though they were received, their interpretation was received by tradition, ve'en bahem mahloket, and there is no dispute on the interpretation. הרי מדקדוק המקרא שניתן לנו אפשר ללמוד אלו הפירושים בדרכי הדין והאסמכתאות. However, by analyzing the text, even though it doesn't say you need to compensate a person with, by paying him for blinding his eye, or even though it doesn't say that you have to take an etrog as a citrus fruit, it's not explicit in the text of the Torah. However, by proper analysis of the text of the Torah, using the 13 midot, you would be able, or the Chachamim could have inferred it anyways, even if we haven't received the tradition on it. From analysis, proper, accurate analysis, שניתן לנו, אפשר ללמוד אלו הפירושים, you could learn these interpretations בדרכי הדין והאסמכתאות והרמזים וההוראות שיש במקרא. And this was a huge project that Rabbi Akiva took upon himself to do. Well, up until the times of Rabbi Akiva, none of the Chachamim necessarily, right, in the 1500 years prior to Rabbi Akiva, nobody attempted to connect every single halacha that we received the tradition on, tie it into the text itself. This was later Hachamim decided to do that. He says, but it was possible to do that with almost all of the halachot that we received. וכשתראה בתלמוד נושאים ונותנים ונחלקים על דרך העיון, and when you open up a sugya in the Talmud, in the Gemara, and you see two different hachamim. One has one opinion of what is peri etz hadar, what is a citrus fruit, right? One says hadar be'ilano mishana leshana. Peri etz hadar, how do we know it's talking about an etrog? Because it's a fruit. Hadar, actually, one of the meanings of the word hadar means like beautiful or special. That's one interpretation. Another one is to live, right? Darim be'eretz Yisrael. They live in the land of Israel. Darim be'eretz Yisrael. So peri etz hadar says it's a fruit that lives in the tree all year round. Because an etrog doesn't fall off the tree. It can continue growing from one year to another and continue growing and growing. And so they say maybe that is a way you could infer from the text of the Torah that it's talking about an etrog. And another hacham will say, no, hadar hanamayim. It needs to reside on the waters. You give a different reasoning through the text of why it has to be an etrog and not a pomegranate. No, sorry, not a pomegranate. An eshkolit, a grapefruit, or something else. Right? So they're having a debate between the Chachamim al derech ha'iyun. What is the proper one of the 13 midot to use to prove that in fact it's talking about the etrog? Each one brings his own re'ayah, his own proof, his own reasoning. על אחד מן הפירושים הללו ודומיהם. כמו שאמרו על אומרו יתעלה פרי עץ הדר, אולי הוא הרימון, right? Like they said about the פרי עץ הדר, right? The citrus fruit, אולי הוא הרימון. Maybe it's talking about a pomegranate, or the parish, or any other fruit, or zulatan. עד שהביאו ראיה מאומרו פרי עץ, ואמרו עץ שתם עצו ופריו שווים. Right? So it's like the Hachamim, they're raising like a rhetorical question. How do we know it's an etrog? Maybe it's actually a pomegranate. Right? And the Chacham would say, the same Chacham who asked the question would say, my proof that it's an etrog is, it says, peri etz, right? Peri, the fruit of the tree. Shetam etzo upirio shavin, right? That the taste, the flavor of the fruit and the flavor of the bark of the tree is equal. I've never tested this to see if you eating the bark of an etrog tree is actually taste the same as taking a bite out of the etrog itself. I think there's a whole other interpretation to this specific interpretation. Ve'amar acher, and a different hacham, he brought a different reasoning. Peri hadar be'ilano mishana leshana. Says no, hadar, like we said before, means to live. So it's talking about a fruit that lives in its tree from year to year. Ve'amar acher, peri hadar al kol mayim, that lives on all waters. Ve'en ze mipnei shadavar safek etzlam. And this isn't because they have a question whether the proper fruit for peri etz hadar is an etrog or something else. They all agree to that. It's not that they had some sort of question and they needed to analyze the pesukim and reach a conclusion. Ela ראינו בלי ספק מיהושע עד עכשיו שהאתרוג הוא הניתן עם הלולב בכל שנה. Right? We have seen all our lives, every single generations, from the times of Yehoshua all the way to the conclusion of the Talmud, that every single year, when we take the four minim, one of those four minim is the etrog, and that is the fruit the Torah refers to when it says peri etz hadar. Ve'en machloket bechach, and there is no dispute about that. Ve'rak hakru al hahora'a sheyesh b'mikra lipirush hamikubal hazeh. And the only dispute was what is the best way to prove using the 13 midot to extract it from the text. And each one will have a different proof. And that's what their dispute is. And all other disputes that we see, maybe 90% of the disputes in the Talmud are all based on this principle that we have no dispute what the actual law is. The dispute is what is the proper way to learn it from the text of the Torah itself. And this is what they mean when they say klaloteha, its generalities, ufaratoteha, and its specifics, meaning ha'inyanim shetiye otanu lemedim otan bichlal ufrat. Right? There are 13 midot. One of the midot is actually called klal ufrat, the general and the specific. So sometimes the Torah will say something generally and then go into specifics, and then we could learn from some based on something else that also only gives a general rule, and we apply the specifics of the first instance to the general rule of the second. That's one of the 13 midot. וכן ביתר 13 midot. So it says נאמרו כללותיה ופרטותיה, means all the specifics, all the accepted interpretation was already received, right? Even though we can learn it to 13 midot, they all הם קבלה ממשה מסיני. אלא שאף על פי שהם קבלה ממשה, לא אמרו בהן הלכה למשה מסיני. But we don't say that Peri Etz Hadar being a rimon is a halacha leMoshe miSinai. Why do we not designate that as halacha leMoshe miSinai? Shanu she'en anu omrim Peri Etz Hadar hu etrog halacha leMoshe miSinai. O chovel b'chaviro mishalem lo mamon halacha leMoshe miSinai. Right, or someone who injures his friend needs to pay him with money, right? An eye for an eye. We don't say that's halacha leMoshe miSinai, even though it is an interpretation that we received. Because we don't designate those as halacha leMoshe miSinai, because we have already established that all the interpretations we received in tradition from Moshe. ויש להם, כמו שאמרנו, רמזים במקרא. And they're all inferred or hinted at from in the text of the Torah itself. Or שנלמדים באחד המידות, or they can be extrapolated using one of the 13 midot, the Moshe Amanu, as we have said. So does anybody have an idea what those specific halachot are that are referred to as halacha leMoshe miSinai? Any ideas? First of all, any questions on this big chunk that we just read? Okay.
Oh yeah, I have a question.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and because I'm בגלל אני חדשה פה, אני לא יודעת איפה ספר אתה קורא.
Oh, so this passage specifically that we're reading is from Maimonides' Introduction to the Mishnah. This entire text is, the whole booklet here, 38 pages, is compiled by 4 main sources. 2 of them from Maimonides, either his introduction to the Mishnah, his introduction to his legal codex, right? Another one is, who remembers? Who can answer her question? Why am I doing the work for you? Anybody remember? All right, so the other 2 was, one of them is by one of the later Hachamim after the conclusion of the Talmud. His name was Rav Shira Gaon. He was the head of one of the yeshivot in Bavel, where the Talmud itself was concluded, and he received a question from one of the communities in Tunis about how was the Talmud and the Mishnah compiled. And he responded in a very, very long letter explaining everything. So I bring things from that letter as well. And another one is a book called Sefer HaKabbalah, the Book of Tradition, by Rabbi Avraham ibn Daoud. Maybe he lived like generation and a half to 2 generations before the Rambam in Spain. And he wrote a book, which is basically a book on history, starting from Adam all the way to him. And he gives some historical context to all these things that we'll be seeing throughout this work.
Okay.
This specifically is Maimonides.
So how old is the book we are reading?
This section that's quoted is about 800 years old.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So if everything that we learned from Moshe, right, is essentially Halacha Moshe Sinai, why is it that only like about 30 specific halachot are designated Halacha Moshe Sinai? He says, "V'chol inyan she'en lo remez b'mikra ve'lo asmachta ve'i efshar lelamedo be'echad hamidot be'ele bilvad omrim halacha leMoshe Sinai." Says, however, any halacha that we have that the Hachamim could not find a way to associate that halacha with a pasuk, they couldn't apply one of the 13 midot on the text in order to learn this halacha, then they say halacha leMoshe Sinai. For instance, you can see two Hachamim arguing. It says, how do you know that this is the halacha? It says, oh, well, you can learn it peri etz hadar be'ilano mishana l'shana. Okay, very nice. I mean, we know this already for thousands of years, but here I can show you how I could have learned it from the text. Another one say, okay, and how about ayin tachat ayin? And he'll use a different midah, use klal uprat to show how you could have learned it if you didn't know from the text. And then they'll reach halacha, okay, the tefillin. Tefillin, the halacha is it needs to be black and it needs to be square. How are you going to prove that? There's none of the Chachamim were able to find a way to prove it. So how do you know? Halacha leMoshe Sinai. That's the tradition we received. We know this in tradition. I have no way of proving it from the text. My only proof is the tradition that we received. And on those few specific halachot are what the Hachamim specifically designated as halacha leMoshe Sinai. ולפיכך, therefore, כשאמרנו שיעורים הלכה למשה מסיני, says, how do you know that a kizayit is a kizayit, or certain things you have, like for instance, matzah, you have to eat a kizayit of. Another thing, you have to eat a kebesa, something the size of an egg. Some things, in order to be yotzes, to be the size of an olive. Some things that you get tum'ah, even if it's called kehardal, right? Like a grain of mustard. So how do we know what's what? They say halacha leMoshe Sinai. When they say shiurin halacha leMoshe ikshenu al zeh. All right, we gave some of the Chachamim said, how could you say it's halacha leMoshe Sinai? איך תאמר עליהם שלאכל משה מסיני, והרי השיעורים רמוזים, right? But they are, how do you call it? But you can, they're hinted in the pasuk, eres chita us'ora. Or for instance, what beracha do you say before what? There's a halacha on what to say before what. It said, והייתה תשובה על זה, שם הלכה למשה מסיני. It says, oh, there's a pasuk, eres chita us'ora. So they're hinted in this pasuk. No, but the Chachamim said, even though you try to find some sort of hint from it in the pasuk, it's not one of the 13 midot over there. It's just a way for us to remember. How do we remember what to say before what? We could look at the pasuk, right? Eres hita u'sorah, give him te'ena v'rimon, and we say, okay, so whatever comes first in the pasuk, we'll say the beracha on that first. והייתה תשובה זה שמלאכה למשה מסיני, right? ואין להם שום יסוד שילמדו ממנו באחת המידות. But there is no actual way to extrapolate that halacha from the pasuk using one of the 13 midot. ואין להם רמז בכל התורה. They don't have a real concrete hint or something to suggest it in the text of the Torah. אלא הסמיכום לפסוק זה כאין סימן. But the Chachamim, they associated it with a certain pasuk just as a way, like a sign, a way for us to remember. כדי שישמרום ויזכרום. To remember it. ואין זה מעניין הפסוק, but that's not really what the pasuk is talking about, and it's not really a concrete way to learn it. וזהו עניין אומרם, and this is what the Chachamim say, קרא אסמכתה בעלמא. Right? Kara is the text of the Mikra. This is in Aramaic. Asmachta be'alma. It's just a way to associate it. It's not a real proof. It's not, it doesn't hold in court. Bechol makom shenizkar. All right. Understood what is Halacha Moshe Sinai and what's the difference between what's designated in Halacha Moshe Sinai and all the other halachot, which we also received from Sinai. Is understood? Any questions? All right. Last week we got a lot of questions. Today everyone's quiet. Okay, so we're going to get into Dinim, Muflaim, V'Takanot. All right, these are the three things under the jurisdiction of the court. Right, what are these three things? This is now quoting from the Mishnah Torah, the Maimonides legal code. Harehu Omer, Al HaTorah Ashel Yerucha, Al Pi HaTorah Ashel Yerucha, in according to the Torah, that they being the court, shall instruct you, Elu HaGezerot V'Takanot, V'Aminagot Sheyuru Behem L'Rabim, right? They have the authority to make certain gezerot, enact certain prohibitions that are not biblical prohibitions. They're sources from the Beit Din, right? In order, there has to be for the specific reason, in order to an extra safeguard for the Torah. Like we mentioned earlier with not eating chicken or poultry with dairy. There's a specific reason for that enactment, and that was because people, even though poultry used to be allowed to have it with dairy, because it's not considered meat, right? The Chachamim saw that people were starting to associate poultry with meat and get confused, and because they're allowed to cook their schnitzel in butter, then they would also cook their steaks in butter. And so to prevent the people from making that mistake, they also said, you know what? Poultry, chicken too, cannot be eaten with dairy. So those are the gezerot. All right, and the second part of the jurisdiction, according to the law that they tell you you shall do, these are the things, the new situations that came to court that the Hachamim learned using the 13 midot, right? And the third, and everything that they shall tell you, that refers to zu hakabala shekibelu ish mipi ish. This is the tradition. They have the authority to tell you what is the tradition that we receive from one generation to another. So let's get into the Gezerot. All right, back to the Perush HaMishnayot. The Gezerot, הם הדינים שקבעום הנביאים והחכמים שבכל דור ודור על דרך הגדר והסייג לתורה. All right, these are the laws that the prophets, from the times of the prophets, right, all the way to the Chachamim, in every single generation had its own Gezerot that were added for the specific reason of making like a boundary before the Torah, to not transgress an actual Isur of the Torah. They made an Isur that will prevent you from even coming close to the Isur of the Torah. והם שציווה השם לעשותם באופן כללי, and this is a mitzvah that the Beit Din received, right? So there's a biblical mitzvah, meaning mitzvah deoraita, biblical mitzvah for the Beit Din to make gezerot. Be'omro ushmartem et mishmarti, right? It says, the pasuk says ushmartem et mishmarti. You should heed my mishmeret, right? What guards you. You should make a safeguard to the safeguard. B'Kabbalah, right? And we received in tradition, asu mishmeret le mishmarti. You should make another mishmeret to my mishmeret, right? The mishmeret being the Torah, and you should make another safeguard to the Torah. This is a mitzvah of a biblical mitzvah to the Beit Din, to the judges. V'hem shekorim otam hazal gezerot. And these laws are what the Chachamim refer to as gezerot. Ubahem yesh shetiyet mahloket. And in these laws, there could be a mahloket. There could be a dispute between the Chachamim. כגון שיראה לאדם לאסור כך משום כך ואחר לא יראה לו. Right? One Chacham will see that it's time to put a certain Isur on the Tzibur, and another Chacham says, I don't think it's required. I really don't think that we should be adding extra Isurim. וזה הרבה בתלמוד. And these mahlokot you'll find a lot in the Talmud. Right? So a very big portion of the mahlokot that we'll find in the Talmud, the disputes between the Chachamim, is on the gezerot, things that originated by the Chachamim, and not things that we have a tradition on. Rabbi Peloni gazar mishum kach v'chach, Rabbi Peloni lo gazar. One Chacham decided to make a gezerah, right, for whatever reason that he had, and a different Chacham, he didn't accept it. He didn't find any reason to make a gezerah. V'zoi ahat misibot ha'machloket. And this is one of the reasons that we'll find disputes in the Talmud. Halo tireh shebasar of b'halav hu gezerah midrabbanan yarachik min ha'avera. Right? You can see that the prohibition of eating poultry with dairy is a gezerah midrabbanan. It's something that the Chachamim enacted in order to prevent the people from transgressing an isur deoraita, biblical prohibition. Ve'eno asur min haTorah ela besar behema tehora. And the only thing that is actually prohibited by the Torah is the flesh of an animal, like a goat. Lo teva shel gedi b'chalev imo. Talking about a goat. Ve'asru hachamim besar of k'dei larchik min hadavar ha'asur. And the Chachamim saw it was right in their eyes to also make this isur, to not eat poultry with dairy, in order to prevent people from not eating meat with dairy. Umehem mishen lo nir'et lo gezerah zu. Right? But among the Chachamim, there were those who didn't see any reason to enact this gezerah. And he says, no, well, we don't need to be, extra pious and be osir and prohibit things that the Torah allows us to do. לפי שרבי יוסי הגלילי היה אוסר אכילת בשר עוף, לא היה אוסר אכילת בשר עוף בחלב. There's a word missing here. Right? רבי יוסי הגלילי, he didn't make that prohibition. והיו אנשי מקומו כולם אוכלים אותו, כמו שנתבהר בתלמוד. You know, all the people up in the Galilee, they continued eating dairy with their poultry. They'd have a nice piece of chicken or turkey or whatever, and they'd eat it and drink their coffee at the same time. There was no problem with that. וכשתהיה הסכמת הכל על אחת מגזרות אלו, אין לעבור עליה בשום פנים. However, when all the Chachamim agree on a certain gezerah, then it is prohibited to go against that gezerah. וכל זמן שפשט איסורה בישראל, by the way, this is also a very big yesod, a very fundamental concept, is that it needs to spread. The isur needs to spread throughout the entire nation. So anytime that you see an isur that's spread out throughout the entire nation, that everybody accepted it on themselves, right? As long as it's spread out, this gezerah cannot be cancelled. Even the prophets can't come and say, okay, it's time to cancel this mitzvah or this isur, this gezerah. ואמרו בתלמוד שאפילו אליהו לא יוכל להתיר אחד מ18 דבר שגזרו עליהן בית שמאי ובית הלל. And they said in the Talmud that even Eliyahu HaNavi himself, he were to come back, and he has semicha, and he knows all the laws, he received them in tradition. He says there are 18 gezerot that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai enacted together. Even Eliyahu Navi cannot annul them. Why? Because you finally get Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai to agree on something and you're going to cancel it. The two main sources of all the disputes in the Talmud, they found common ground and consensus and agreed to enact these 18 gezerot. Even Eliyahu Navi cannot annul them. ונתנו טעם, and they gave a reason לזה, ואמרו לפי שאיסורן פשוט בכל ישראל, because these gezerot, they spread out throughout the entire nation. Everybody accepted it, right? And there are people who go according to Beit Shammai, and there are people who go according to Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel both enacted this gezerah. Everybody accepted it and followed it. And now it cannot ever be canceled. Well, I don't know about not ever, but even Eliyahu HaNavi cannot come and cancel it. Any questions?
Rabbi, example of the gezerot that was mentioned, that was discussed by Beit Hillel and Shammai.
Oh, I don't remember specifically. I'll look it up for you.
Okay.
I'll look it up for you, and I'll get back to you on that. A lot of them had to do with the Beit Mikdash and things like that. Remember, they still had Beit Mikdash in their times. Beit Din shegazru gezerah, right? If a court would come and make a certain gezerah, enact a certain gezerah, or itkinu takana. A takana is a positive gezerah, meaning a gezerah is you are forbidden to do this. A takana is you have to do this. All right? Or itkinu takana v'inhigu minhag, or they came up with a new custom. Upashat ad-davar b'chol Israel, and it spread out throughout the entire nation. Ve'amad acharehem beit din acher, and another beit din comes after them and wants to cancel that gezerah. וביקש לבטל דברי הראשונים ולעקור אותה התקנה ואותה הגזרה ואותו המנהג, and they want to undo it. אינו יכול עד שיהיה גדול מן הראשונים בחוכמה ובמניין. right? He cannot annul it unless that Beit Din is greater than the Beit Din that instituted that Gezerah, greater than them in wisdom and also in numbers, meaning a higher majority. All right. By the way, if a Beit Din is usually a Beit Din that's greater in wisdom, is an indication that that generation is greater in wisdom. So maybe the whole reasoning behind enacting the Gezerah to begin with doesn't apply anymore. Because back then, people were a lot more simple and they didn't understand the difference between poultry and meat, or at least its legal implications. But now we have a much more intelligent generation, and therefore you also have a lot more intelligent dayanim in the Beit Din, and they see that maybe we don't need this gezerah anymore, and in that case they can cancel it. Bameh devarim amurim. In what case are we talking about? Bidvarim shelo asru otan kedei la'asot siyag ela bish'ar dinei Torah. Right, but this is only in cases where that gezerah was enacted not for the sake of preserving the Torah. So, if we go back to poultry and dairy, right, that was enacted in order to do a siyag for the Torah, in order to prevent people from doing a worse isur. That cannot be cancelled. However, if there was some sort of takana that says, for some sort of, let's say, financial matter, it decided that we're going to make things simple by prohibiting rounding up, let's say, you have to pay $35,000.72. Right? No, we're going to round it all up to the next agol number. And it says, no, we don't think we should do. These are things that don't prevent people from doing an isur. And if a later Beit Din says, this is irrelevant to our generation, let's cancel the isur, they can do that. However, if the reason for the gezerah was to do a siyag, like we said, in pashat isuran bechol Israel, and bedin hagadol acher yachol leokran ulhatiram. Right? If it's spread out throughout the entire nation, then the Beit Din does not have the authority to cancel it. Afilu haya gadol min harishonim, even though they were greater and more superior to the previous Beit Din that enacted the gezerah to begin with. All right, Beit Din shenira'a lahem ligzor gezerah or letaken takana. All right, Beit Din sits down, the court sits down, and they say, you know what, I think we need to make a certain gezerah, or le'anig minhag, or to institute a new takana or a new minhag. Tzerichin li'yashev b'davar v'lida tehila. First, they need to assess im rov hatzibur yecholin la'amod ba. Can the majority of the people really follow this? It's not going to be a burden on them. Will the majority of the people accept it upon themselves to follow this gezerah? Or maybe the majority of the people, they're not strong enough to follow this gezerah. ולעולם אין גוזרים גזרה על הציבור, אלא אם כן רוב הציבור יכולים לעמוד בה. And the Beit Din, they can only ever make a gezerah if they know, or if they assess, they may have wrongly assessed, but they have assessed that the majority of the people can follow this gezerah. For instance, they made a gezerah that a man can only pray after he does tevilah, right, if he was with his wife the night before. So you're living, with your spouse, with your wife, you have relations, and you want to go to shaharit the next day. First, you have to go to the mikveh. This was a gezerah that the people that couldn't follow it. They may have wanted to. It was too much of a burden for them. That gezerah was cancelled. It no longer applies. Harek shegazru bedin gezerah. Right? The Beit Din sits down and makes a gezerah. V'dimu sherov hatzibur yicholin la'amod ba. And they really thought that it would be accepted by the people. The people could hold on to this gezerah. V'achar shegazru ota pikpeku ha'am ba ve'lo pashta. Right? But after they made the gezerah, the people, they didn't really, they had their doubts about it, and it didn't really spread. It didn't hold. The people didn't accept it. Ve'lo pashta berov hatzibur, and the majority of the people didn't actually follow it. Harei zu betela. This gezerah is automatically cancelled and annulled. Ve'enan rasha'in lachuf et ha'am lalechet ba. And the Beit Din has no right to enforce this gezerah on the public. Gazru v'dimu shepashta b'chol Yisrael. Okay, so now they made a gezerah, and they thought that it spread out throughout the entire nation. ולאחר זמן מרובה עמד בית דין אחר ובדק, וראה שאין אותה גזרה פושטת בכל ישראל, יש לו רשות לבטלה. Right? They assessed, they say, yeah, we think the majority of the people can follow the gezerah. And maybe for the first few years, the majority of the people did accept the gezerah. But after one generation or two generations, the Beit Din comes and says, wait a minute, we see the people aren't keeping to this gezerah anymore. And they check, and they see that maybe only a few people, Hasidim, still follow this gezerah, even though it was fully enacted by the Beit Din. Then that Beit Din can sit down and cancel that gezerah. So we'll say there's two main criteria for a gezerah to hold. Who knows? Anybody? Time to start volunteering, people. Let's see. Elena, how about you? Can't hear. So what are the main criteria for a gezerah to hold? First of all, it needs to be...
Sorry, Sami. There are a couple of Elenas. Who did you actually ask?
No, just what are the criteria for a gezerah, for the Beit Din to make a gezerah and for it to stick, for it to be binding, legally binding on the people?
My understanding is that the majority have to accept it.
Right. So it's not just the majority. Yeah, right. What does that mean? The majority accepts it. First of all, the Beit Din need to assess that the majority can follow it. It's not going to be too much of a burden on them. And you are right. The people have to accept it. It needs to spread out throughout the entire nation, and the majority of the people need to accept it. This goes back to the whole fundamental of the whole Torah Shebe'al Peh. When we received the Torah from Sinai, we received it because we willingly contracted a covenant with God. Nothing can be forced and imposed on us against our will. Even though the Beit Din has the authority to make gezerot, they only have the authority to make gezerot that they see fit and they properly assess that the people can accept it and will accept it upon themselves. And if they don't, then the Gezerah is cancelled. It's as if they had no authority to enact it to begin with. So God himself is bound by this rule, right? That we are only bound by the things that we agreed to be bound by at Sinai. And once the Torah passed from the realm of the sky, right, of heavens to the Beit Din on earth, the Beit Din needs to continue in this, according to this fundamental principle, that only if the people are going to accept it, and b'di'avad, meaning looking backwards, if the people have accepted it, does this gezerah still hold? It's all based on the people's consensus. If it's spread out throughout the people, the nation, and they accepted it. And here I have a question of my own that I asked. This is one of the only things that I actually wrote in this text, is the footnotes. Right today, there are so many gezerot. What happened is, we were out in 2,000 years of exile, spread out throughout the entire world, right? There was a community in Poland who was struggling with a certain issue, and they made a gezerah. And another community in Morocco was struggling with a different issue, and they made their own gezerah. And every community had all of their gezerot, and then they started copying gezerot from each other. So there's most of the Torah today is all gezerot, and not the actual biblical prohibitions. And we see that the majority of the people don't have this energy and don't have this will to follow all of these gezerot. And especially in a lot of these gezerot didn't originate from the Talmud and from the actual Beit Din, our last Supreme Court, but from the different communities. Right, that every rabbi in the different communities throughout the generations enacted, which they don't have authority over the entire nation. Maybe there's place to come and cancel many of them, because we see today most of the nation don't follow the Torah. They don't even follow the mitzvot deoraita. A lot of them. Because of all the extra prohibitions, many people don't even follow the actual prohibitions of the Torah. They say, forget it, it's too much. And instead of being a fence to prevent you from doing an isur, all these extra gezerot serve they serve as a wall keeping people away from the Torah. This is just a question that I have. I have no answer for it. And this is only something that a Beit Din Hagadol, once it's reinstituted, can reach a decision about. That's pretty much our lesson for today.
Sami, can I have a question just before we finish?
Yes, of course.
So I think some of these gezerot have been cancelled before, right? So, for example, I've read somewhere that the prohibition to eat bread cooked by a non-Jew, baked by a non-Jew, some communities decided to kind of like abandon that and can have bread baked by a non-Jew. So how do they decide what they follow and what do they stop following at this point if we don't have the the big Beit Din?
That one actually is a little bit more difficult, because that is a Talmudic prohibition, meaning it was actually originated from the Beit Din. And so long as the majority of the people still accept it, it can't really be canceled. However, they did give reasoning for those prohibitions. And in many instances, that reasoning doesn't really apply. Also, Yen Nesech also has, they all have the same reasoning, really, right? So there's the legal reasoning behind it is that we're afraid that pagan goyim will use wine as a way of idol worship. But really, the reason why the Chachamim made these isurim of the wine of goyim and the cheese of goyim and the bread of goyim is to prevent the people from mingling too much with goyim, right? Like we see in Megillat Esther, a lot of the big issue started when all the Jews attended the parties of Hashverosh, is the wine parties and getting drunk together with the goyim. And this is something that the Chachamim saw fit to prevent. Now, should it always apply? Not necessarily. I don't know. Muslims aren't considered to be pagans. So does that legal reasoning apply anymore? Not really, but the real reasoning behind it did apply. That they didn't want the people mingling too much with the goyim in their nation. However, now we're in Eretz Yisrael, right? The goyim here are a minority. Maybe it's not as big of an issue anymore. But in order to actually change these or cancel these gezerot, that would really require a Beit Din to do it. This is a good example, by the way, of a gezerah that was made not necessarily as a fence, a gader to keep the Torah, to prevent people from doing an isur, but it was because the Chachamim at the time saw a certain issue that they wanted to prevent the people from doing. There is no isur to mingle with the goyim. And in certain generations, and maybe with certain nations, it could be recommended to mingle with them. At other times, it could have been very problematic. So it could be that some kehilot decided that, you know what, our situation today, or their time, with those specific nation that they were living among, it wasn't as big of an issue. Maybe because they were also the majority, in that there were countries that the Jews were, or cities that the Jews were majority, even in Galut. And so maybe they said, you know what, we don't have to be so strict with it. Most of the people are having a hard time with this din, or with this gezerah, so we're not going to enforce it. Not that the Beit Din today really has any power to enforce anything. Did that answer your
Thank
question?
you. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Maybe Sami, if I can ask you if you can break down yesterday's events, these protests and demonstration, does it influence how?
I'll be 100% honest. I'm really not following what's going on with the protests and demonstrations.
Because it is
I'm just
about
reading that there's protests and everyone's afraid of this new reform that they want to do in the legal system.
that has nothing to do with Beit Din, religious or whatever.
All right, that has to do with the actual the secular Supreme Court of Israel.
Mhm.
Yeah, nothing to do with the Beit Din.
Okay, so the people are just afraid of lack
Right,
of
they're
democracy.
afraid that this reform is going to turn Israel into a dictatorship, which basically what the reform comes to do, in my opinion, is the exact opposite. It's saying that it's managed today like a dictatorship, giving the rights of a few judges, and it's really just like a few judges, to overrule the rulings of the Knesset itself, of the elected representatives. And these few judges that are sitting in the Supreme Court of Israel today, they're not elected officials, and they choose their own people, their own replacements, and they choose people who are who think like them and behave like them, have the same cultural background as them. So there's really just it's very not representative of we'll call it the makeup of the people today. However, I'm not really I'm not a lawyer. I haven't really studied law, so I'm not really qualified to give my input on that. But that's just the way I understand it.
It's already helpful. Thank you very much, because to read all these newspapers and you cannot understand. We are too far
Right.
away.
There's and also, they tend to exaggerate extremely. It's all doomsday scenarios with the far left in this country. Right? Any reform that the right wing wants to do that's it. That's the end. The end of the state of Israel as we know it. And it's far from it. Any other questions?
Rabbi, what's the difference between Pesach, Dinim, and Gezerot?
Sorry, what was the first one? I couldn't hear.
Pesach. P-S-E.
Pesach.
Pesach.
All right, so Pesach is the decree, the decision, is the actual decision. A case comes before the court and they need to decide what they decide. That's the Pesach Halacha. Pesach actually means to cut. Meaning is we're cutting, we're making a decision. From now on, there's only one answer. That's Pesach. And the other, you said Gezerot. Gezerot is what's enacted by the Beit Din, a prohibition enacted by the Beit Din. That's a Gezerah. What was the third one that you asked?
Dinim.
Dinim?
Uh-huh.
Dinim means laws. It could be generally referred to as biblical laws. Din could also be something that was learned through the 13 midot, because we call it 13 midot. Torah nigdeshet b'hem. Say im ladin nekabel, im halacha nekabel, im ladin yesh tshuva. So din is also sometimes referred to as the laws learned through the 13 midot, but not always. Meaning you need to know based on the context of when the word din is mentioned, if it's regarding laws in general, whether it's regarding the 13 midot or things that were learned through the 13 midot, which is what we'll be studying next, din mufla, specifically dinim that were learned through the 13 midot. And also din also means judgment, as in, say God has midat hadin and midat rahamim. This is sometimes, we try to appeal to God's merciful side, and sometimes we perceive God through his judgmental side. That's also called din. Yom Hadin is the day of judgment. That's the Rosh Hashanah, is Yom Hadin.